This is Primetime Thursday.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings. The program you are about to see comes on the heels of yesterday's massive raid against an international drug ring smuggling millions of doses of ecstasy into the country. More than 100 arrests were made in the U.S. and Canada. Our program is about this drug, ecstasy, which the government has been unable to control.
You know, when I think about it, that first time, it was like 2.5 hours of complete and utter rest. Rest from worry, rest from anxiety.
You can walk up to perfect strangers and have a conversation with them like you've known them your entire life. You smile at people and they smile back. Like, you just feel like part of something, like everyone loves you and you love everyone else.
My 19th birthday party, I had like 15 of my closest friends, and we all did it, and we all just sat in a room and just bonded, and everybody like opened up and shared and gave massages to each other, and it was still, if I look back, probably the best birthday I've ever had.
Young people don't just like this drug, they almost love this drug. The experience of it is particularly capturing, which makes it particularly frightening at the same time. When you're having a good time with chemistry, you tend to forget about the possibility it's going to turn on you and cause some real problems for you.
Using ecstasy is much like a game of Russian roulette, in which we put one bullet in the revolver, spin the chamber, and pull the trigger. The law of averages suggests that somebody is going to get a bullet in the brain.
A friend had some, and so I tried it because it sounded like it was wonderful, and it was.
This was perfect. It was like, split it in half if you want, take the whole thing, pop it in your mouth, zoom, you know? Couldn't have asked for something easier and better.
This drug may be one of the hardest drugs to effectively prohibit, because it seems to create lots of satisfied customers and a relatively small number of unhappy customers. And a drug like that is likely to spread far and wide.
It was the most beautiful night in my life. It was the best feeling I've ever felt.
The world was never like this before. How could it be this beautiful now?
Yes, it changed my life.
You just look at everything in the most positive light. It's a great feeling.
Having a new major drug arrive on the scene is something that happens every half century or so. This is a major event in drug history.
The facts about ecstasy use are astonishing. According to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, hundreds of millions of ecstasy pills are taken by Americans every year. Nearly 2 million new users are recruited every year. In the 1990s, ecstasy seemed to come out of nowhere, to join marijuana, cocaine, and heroin as one of the 4 most widely used illegal drugs in the country. No other drug has ever spread so fast. So how did it happen? After decades of waging a war on drugs, how did ecstasy emerge from total obscurity to become an illicit drug of choice for a generation? That is our story, about a drug that has become a nightmare for the government's drug controllers. Ecstasy came into this world as 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA for short. It didn't exist in nature until chemists working for the German pharmaceutical company Merck synthesized it by accident in their laboratories in 1912. No use for the new molecule was discovered, and MDMA remained little more than a formula on faded paper for more than 60 years. It was the scientific quest of this man, Alexander Shulgin, that rescued MDMA from obscurity.
I've always been interested in psychopharmacology. How much could I use my skill at creating new compounds that are psychoactive? How many could I make that would be different?
In 1966, Shulgin quit his job as a chemist for Dow Chemical to devote himself entirely to the study of psychoactive drugs, drugs that alter the mind.
What I'm searching for are materials that could open up ways of understanding how the mind works. And each of these materials was a tool, a research tool, with the different colors and different shades and opening up different parts of the mind. MDMA is one of these.
In 1976, in his laboratory near Berkeley, California, Shulgin synthesized MDMA, which was not illegal at the time, and tested it on himself.
I saw it as almost like an intoxicant. I could see where I could have gotten really into the knack of using it, except my search was not being pleasurably turned on. My search was finding new things.
Shulgin called it window, because he thought this was like looking through a window of the world at the world the way it really is, that we have covered over by our habits and so on. And as we remove those barriers, we see it in utter clarity. And that's what MDMA does. It melts, dissolves away those barriers. We see the world as it really is. It's a marvelous experience. I highly recommend it.
MDMA is one of hundreds of mind-altering compounds that Shulgin has synthesized and tested. In books and papers, he has published the formulas and the effects of each. His critics argue that Shulgin is simply providing a roadmap for drug abuse.
I believe that every single thing that is known about a drug, good and bad, should be available to everyone who's considering using that drug.
One person Shulgin thought should try MDMA was his friend Leo Zeff. Zeff was one of the leaders in an underground community of psychotherapists that was treating patients with LSD and other psychedelic drugs.
Leo thought MDMA was absolutely outstanding, just almost unbelievable. He went on a campaign and introduced MDMA to therapists all over the country and even going to Europe. He told me that he'd introduced about 150 therapists to MDMA and how to use it properly.
Dr. Leo Zeff, he introduced me to it, and I was immediately impressed, as he was and many others were, by its usefulness. The very fact that it doesn't change ordinary perception very much, but changes the feeling tone, the feeling quality, and reduces fear, thereby allowing you to look at in a kind of impartial way things that are normally just too anxiety-provoking to look at.
In 1983, Kathy Tam was raped and tortured in a park in Northern California. Her attacker was never caught.
I just felt broken into just 1,000 pieces. I felt like shattered glass. It was very difficult to carry on in a normal way because I was afraid of my own shadow. Everything frightened me.
What I was thinking was that I didn't have my wife with me. I was worried that we were going to lose her forever, that she was not going to come back to normal. It was a pretty scary time. We had 2 little kids. She was not functioning on a normal basis.
I had been in therapy and had been blocked by how much I didn't remember. I mean, I had a lot of support from my husband and friends and in therapy, but I needed something more.
A friend referred Kathy Tam to a psychotherapist who was giving MDMA to patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder.
By taking the MDMA, it's like my mind allowed me to grapple with and remember the pieces that I couldn't or wouldn't allow myself to remember.
Over a period of time, she was able to get back in touch with the kids and be with them and be a loving mother again. I'm certain that wouldn't have happened without the MDMA.
Without that, I can't tell you where I'd be. I'd probably still be back there, hiding out in my house.
The people who were traumatized, see, could look at the situation that traumatized them, like the woman who was raped or assaulted, could look at the situation and surround the whole memory of it with this sort of empathic frame that allowed her then to lower the defenses and allowed her to see exactly what had happened, which had been blocked.
By the late 1970s, the circle of people who had tried Alexander Shulgin's compound was growing. Word about MDMA had spread well beyond the psychotherapy community.
When I first heard about the wide popular usage of MDMA under the name of ecstasy, I was quite saddened, because I was convinced from what I had seen that it was going to could have a marvelous role in medical use. And this broadcast popular usage would inevitably lead to its removal from availability. And indeed, that is what did happen.
It was this man, more than anyone else, who saw the mass appeal of Shulgin's compound. Michael Clegg had spent 14 years studying for the priesthood.
I had my whole life wanted to know the thoughts of God. When I had my first experience with ecstasy, it was like, Moses on the mountain with the revelation.
Clegg became an evangelist for MDMA, and it was Clegg who rechristened it Ecstasy.
I think I had three callings in my life. One was to the priesthood, one was falling in love with my wife and to get married, and this was the third one. My mission was to get ecstasy to the whole world. We would invite friends over to our house from Dallas, and we would say, we're going to share a substance with you that you've never heard about, but if you trust us, you'll take this. Their lives were totally touched. They walked out of there wanting to share it with their friends.
And share they did. Almost overnight, Clegg's ecstasy would be all over Dallas. Michael Clegg was about to become Ecstacy's first millionaire. In the early 1980s, Dallas, Texas was ecstasy country. Michael Clegg saw to that.
We just gave it away. We gave it away for years. We never charged for it. And then it started getting prohibitively expensive. I couldn't afford to just give it away. So we started selling it, and the race was on.
Clegg was manufacturing ecstasy in California and flooding Dallas with nearly 500,000 pills a month. It was perfectly legal.
When I first got here, instead of my focus being on what I considered the priority drugs, heroin and cocaine, I started getting all these calls on ecstasy, MDMA. It was not illegal, and it was being sold at nightclubs, very popular here in Dallas.
Ecstasy was popular with everyone from housewives to urban cowboys. At Southern Methodist University, it was the party drug of choice. And nowhere was ecstasy use more rampant than in Dallas nightclubs. This is the start.
They were hearing music they couldn't hear anywhere else. They were in a great room, 10,000 feet or 20,000 feet of black marble. And they had this new drug, which made you want to dance.
I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was legal, that everybody was able to be open about it.
It was big business. Never in the entire time we produced it did the supply ever catch up to the demand. I mean, it was just had its own life. It was doing its own thing, and we could just barely hang on.
The fact of the matter is that you had the, shall I say, the CEO of the drug market, or of ecstasy, living here in Dallas, and he built a clientele that made him a very, very wealthy person. And as long as the drug was not illegal and people were asking for it, our hands were tied.
On May the 31st, 1985, Gene Hayslip, citing evidence that a related drug caused brain damage in rats, used his emergency powers to place ecstasy alongside heroin, LSD, and marijuana as a Schedule I drug. A drug the government says has a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
I would love to have seen some form of control on it, like, a doctor's prescription or only through a psychologist. I mean, that I would like to have seen. But just to say no one can ever take this again, ever, ever, under any circumstances, is sad when you believe in it so much.
Michael Clegg's dream faded in Dallas. The DEA had made MDMA illegal. But for ecstasy, the party was far from over.
The Reagans address the nation. Reporting from ABC News headquarters in New York, Peter Jennings.
Good evening. The President and Mrs. Reagan are just about to make what they regard as a very important speech to the nation. The subject is illegal drugs in the USA. It is Mrs. Reagan's interest in drugs which has helped fire up the president.
Good evening. Usually I talk with you from my office in the West Wing of the White House, but tonight...
In 1986, a year after ecstasy was made illegal, the government mounted a new anti-drug initiative.
I will announce tomorrow a series of new proposals for a drug-free America.
No effort of its kind had ever been introduced with more fanfare than the Reagan administration's Just Say No campaign.
So open your eyes to life, to see it in the vivid colors that God gave us as a precious gift to his children, to enjoy life to the fullest and to make it count. Say yes to your life, and when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
This is Frankie Bones. He's a New Yorker who's often called America's godfather of rave. In the late 1980s, he was producing dance records that had caught on with young people in Britain.
If you were hip in 88, 89, and you were from the UK just starting out as a DJ, you played American records. So I'd have on the dance charts 5 or 6 records in the charts at a time. It was crazy.
In 1989, ecstasy had become wildly popular in Britain. It had all but disappeared in the United States. But criminal organizations were now manufacturing it in Europe. Millions of British youth were taking ecstasy and listening to American dance music at huge underground parties they christened raves.
I get a phone call, do you want to come play a party for 5,000 people in London? I'm thinking, 5,000 people, this is insane. Let's go. We didn't get up on stage till the sun started coming up, and it was like 25,000 people at this party. I've never seen, it was just a sea of people.
It was a sea of people on ecstasy.
I remember being on the plane, and these 25,000 people are inside my head dancing around, and I'm like, how the hell could I ever even begin to recreate what I just experienced?
But he did recreate them in warehouses and empty buildings in the outer boroughs of New York City. He called them storm raves.
We never did 25,000 people, but when I did a 5,000 person party, it was the most underground event that the East Coast of America ever saw.
By about 1993, you pretty much had a rave scene in almost every state in the U.S.
Which meant that ecstasy, most of it smuggled in from Europe, was soon in every state. From the late 1980s to the mid-1990s, millions of people were introduced to ecstasy. They called it the hug drug.
It was fantastic. I mean, everyone was just positive and friendly towards each other. Really quite a world I'd never seen before.
It's an experience with substance where there's intimacy and connection beyond what you have in normal daily life.
People who I never thought I would click with, I click with. People who I would normally not go up to and probably talk to, I talk to.
Just Say No didn't begin to deter this group. This was a growing youth movement that combined dance and drugs and managed to exist for almost a decade with virtually no government response.
The first time I came across ecstasy was in August of 1995. And ecstasy back then wasn't even on the DEA radar. This was something totally new and something totally different. We actually had to educate ourselves and educate our managers and supervisors.
Drug controllers had never seen anything like ecstasy. Positive word of mouth pushed the drug far beyond the confines of the rave scene. In the late 1990s, illegal traffic in the drug exploded.
When I first started prosecuting ecstasy cases, 10,000 pills was considered to be a huge amount of that drug, of the ecstasy drug. Now, that's a drop in the bucket. Couriers bring in 30,000 pills at a time. Organizations bring in hundreds of thousands of pills. The leaders of these organizations are charged with smuggling millions of pills, and it almost seems like each one outdoes the next.
If we're seizing millions of dosage units at a time, and we're seeing ecstasy being used all over the country, I have to believe, and my assessment is, that the abuse of ecstasy is rampant throughout the country.
Well, here's the troubling reality that the DEA now faces. Making ecstasy illegal did little to halt its spread. And in the last 10 years, the government has been trying to convince the millions of Americans who use it, and the millions who might, that they are putting themselves at risk.
It is a myth that ecstasy is a benign, fun drug.
This is not a benign, fun drug. Even occasional use or a single use is like playing Russian roulette with your own brain.
In the late 1990s, Dr. Alan Leshner, as head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, led the government's eventual response to ecstasy.
My observation is that this drug has been particularly glorified in many different venues. Certainly in the youth culture, it's treated as the hug drug, the love drug. It has all kinds of qualities to it. And in the course of that glorification, advocates for the drug have downplayed the risks associated to it. The risks are real.
This postcard was the government's opening salvo in its war against ecstasy, Your Brain After Ecstasy. According to NIDA, the image on the left is a healthy brain, while the brain on the right, which appears dull and full of holes, is said to be showing the effects of ecstasy on serotonin, a brain chemical that regulates mood and sleep and appetite.
I did the Brain on Ecstasy campaign. I believed that if you could show young people a concrete example of something that substance does to a critical organ in your body, that they would then do the cost-benefit analysis in a more sophisticated way, and they might decide not to try this drug or not to use the drug repeatedly.
This is Dr. George Ricarte, the scientist whose work the government has cited repeatedly in its campaign against ecstasy. In 1998, he published the first study to claim that ecstasy causes brain damage in humans. This research was the source of the brain images on the NIDA postcard. Dr. Ricarte's study, paid for by the government and conducted at Johns Hopkins University, suggested that ecstasy users risk losing up to 85% of their brain's serotonin function. 4 years later, Ricarte published another study paid for by the government. This time he claimed that humans could develop Parkinson's disease from what his study called one common recreational dose of ecstasy, the amount that ravers were thought to consume during one night of dancing. The government's headline, based almost entirely on the work of Dr. Ricarte, was chilling. Ecstasy users risk catastrophic brain damage.
It's a psychoactive substance and, just for lack of a better term, turns your brain into Swiss cheese, cuts holes in it, does permanent brain damage, and it's irreversible from the very first time. So the great fear is that we could have a generation of people that have used this drug that appear to be stroke victims and can't even care for themselves by the time they reach their 40th or 50th birthday.
I don't think there's any doubt that some people have been scared away from MDMA use by what they've been told. They saw that picture of holes in the brain and they said, okay, not my brain. So I think that the, if you will, the propaganda effort has had its impact. It competes rather poorly, though, with word of mouth. Particularly, again, when there are old users out there saying, no, not as far as I could tell.
I've taken MDMA 100 times. Over the last 20 years, I feel fine. There are millions of people who have taken MDMA and don't obviously look brain damaged. Somehow in our culture, we've developed this belief in science so much so that we ignore the evidence in front of our own eyes.
When I read some of the stuff that's printed by the government these days about ecstasy, I just laugh. I just break up laughing. I mean, you know, I've read that one pill can cause Parkinson's disease and things like this, that it's like, wow, I know thousands of people that have taken thousands of them, and I don't know anybody that's had Parkinson's disease.
In 2002, a prestigious British journal, The New Scientist, challenged the U.S. government's position on ecstasy. The magazine had leading independent scientists look at the evidence and answer the question, does MDMA harm brain cells? The journal concluded, the jury is still out.
So you can see the front of the brain, the back of the brain.
Dr. Stephen Kish is one of the world's leading researchers studying the chemistry of the brain, and he is one of the few scientists willing to openly criticize the government's claims about ecstasy and brain damage. He is especially critical of the NIDA postcard and the science behind it.
The problem with these index cards given to young people by NIDA is that the brain scan pictures in the ecstasy users looked like there were actually holes, large holes in the brain, and that's just not true. I think for me the main problem with the index cards is that it was based on faulty data. The faulty data from Riccardi's 1998 study.
Dr. Riccardi said in this first study that the serotonin reduction could be from 50 to 85% in the subjects he examined. Do you believe that to be an accurate assessment?
No, I don't. Something, in my opinion, went very wrong in his brain scan study, something in the measurement procedure. And I think many other scientists would draw no conclusions whatsoever from his study, because his study was simply too flawed.
According to Dr. Kish, there were two fundamental problems with the Riccardi serotonin study. First, Dr. Riccardi could not have been certain that his subjects had actually used ecstasy, even on a single occasion, because he never confirmed it by testing samples of their hair. Second, in one group of subjects, Dr. Riccardi found that some brains had about 40 times more serotonin than others. Scientists say such a variation is simply not possible. Dr. Kish and other scientists now point to a German study as the most important one in the field. Published in 2003, it found only a slight 5% loss of serotonin function. And unlike Dr. Riccardi, the German scientists confirmed that their subjects had used ecstasy by testing hair samples.
This study, I think, is by far the best study published so far, in terms of the, accuracy of the measurement and the general design and the sample size, which is quite large.
Dr. Mark Laruelle studies the effects of illegal drugs on the brain. He is one of the leading brain imaging experts in the world.
The German study showed that in people who had used ecstasy, but who had stopped taking ecstasy for at least 2 or 3 months, normal serotonin function was found. So this study suggests that there is indeed a reduction in serotonin function in subjects that are using ecstasy, but that reduction might be reversible after 2 or 3 months of abstinence.
So the German study suggests that the U.S. government's claim that ecstasy causes devastating, irreversible brain damage was a dramatic exaggeration of the risk.
Riccardi published a finding indicating a massive, almost a near total in some brain areas, 50 to 85%, a massive loss of the serotonin marker. And the Germans, instead of finding this massive loss, they reported just the slightest 4 to 5% change. But still, I would suggest that the public should hold off on final judgment on this question. We only have one study, the German study, that we put some faith in. I would like to see the German results replicated.
But if I hear you correctly on the first Riccardi study, you just think it's plain bad science.
Yes. But you'd have to ask Riccardi why did he make those statements.
And remember Dr. Riccardi's 2002 study, the one that claimed humans could develop Parkinson's disease from one common recreational dose of ecstasy? This dire warning was based on experiments performed on monkeys, injected with what Dr. Riccardi claimed was ecstasy.
Other items in the national news tonight. One of the country's leading researchers into the effects of the drug ecstasy has admitted a major flaw in his research. Dr. George Riccardi of Johns Hopkins University has retracted a study published last year which claimed that a single night of using ecstasy can cause serious brain damage and even Parkinson's disease. Dr. Riccardi admitted he mistakenly gave methamphetamine, a far more toxic substance than ecstasy, to the monkeys he used in the study.
In his retraction letter to the journal Science, Dr. Riccardi blamed his problems on a labeling error by his pharmaceutical supplier, RTI International. The company has rejected the doctor's story, saying it found no evidence of a labeling error.
Young people don't believe, many of them, that MDMA causes holes in your brains, will profoundly inhibit your ability to be a student, or reduce your capacity for emotional expression, because they don't see that directly. So I think that that kind of exaggeration of risk is harmful in and of itself, more so even than the drugs, because it causes people to believe nothing that they're told.
The government-funded studies, they seem to be funding studies that are guaranteed to find something wrong with it. I mean, I just don't trust them.
I'll tell you what, I think the government loses credibility every time they lie about the drug. Every time I hear something which is patently untrue about the drug, it just makes me think, well, they're going to lie about everything.
There's a very, very heavy cost to the process of devaluing information that comes from the government. Lincoln was right. Public trust in government is a precious resource. And there's a question about how much of it we want to squander on telling kids not to use drugs.
If the government took a more honest approach and was more respectful of people's intelligences, I think they would actually build credibility instead of just derision.
We said at the beginning of this program that ecstasy is a nightmare for the government's drug controllers, and in part it is a nightmare of their own making. The government has been determined to stop the spread of ecstasy by making dramatic claims about brain damage that are exaggerated and unconvincing, and the ecstasy users we talk to are simply not listening. This year, if current trends continue, 1.8 million Americans will try ecstasy for the first time. Only marijuana will attract more first-timers. And the government's message is still, just say no.
Autopsy report, case number 00-. Body said to be well-developed, well-nourished adult Caucasian female.
The latest campaign against ecstasy is now focused on the tragic fact that people have died from taking the drug.
Cardial surfaces of the 280-gram heart are...
But even a former director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse describes the risk of death as minimal.
Do you believe that pure ecstasy can cause people to die?
I think that there are some individuals who are especially vulnerable to this drug, and it will kill them. Are there a lot? I don't believe that there are a lot.
A New York medical examiner looked at the role that ecstasy played in unnatural and accidental deaths in New York City.
I reviewed all of the deaths that occurred about over a 3-year period that were reported to the medical examiner's office and underwent autopsy. That included about a total of 19,000 deaths. Of those 19,000 deaths, I found 22 had ecstasy in their system, and 2 of those died from ecstasy and ecstasy only. There are probably prescription medications that people die from more frequently than MDMA.
2 deaths during a period when, according to the DEA, New Yorkers used about 110 million doses of ecstasy. Ecstasy users know from their own experience that the risk of sudden death is minuscule. Overstating this risk is not going to stop them from taking the drug. But there are risks that many ecstasy users do understand. Ecstasy is a street drug. When ecstasy was made illegal, criminals got involved. And to maximize profits, dealers often mix ecstasy with cheaper, more dangerous substances.
We've seen all different kinds of fake ecstasy pills, pills that are made out of speed, pills laced with heroin, with PCP, with really anything imaginable. And it's a little pill, and it looks like a little pill, but it doesn't come out of a bottle that's sealed in a drugstore. There could be anything in that pill.
And no one can claim that even pure ecstasy is safe, especially when it is taken at places like a rave or a nightclub.
This drug does elevate body temperature, especially in an environment like a rave where there's a lot of people compacted in a small area and the temperatures are hot. The ecstasy interferes with the body's ability to adjust to surrounding temperature, and so you get hyperthermia.
This dangerous condition resulting from severe overheating and dehydration can usually be controlled with water and rest. But a small number of users do say they have become deeply dependent on the drug.
It's addicting. It's very addicting, because there's nothing that feels like that. Once you're off of it, you're depressed.
When I'm on ecstasy, I feel like, oh my God, I love this feeling. I never want it to leave me. So you just start taking more pills.
it's just a downward spiral. It may be good for the moment, but the after effects aren't worth it. They're not even close to worth it. It's your life, man. You know? Your life.
But the bottom line for many users is that ecstasy is not heroin, and it is not cocaine or crack cocaine. And many people simply believe that ecstasy, MDMA, is powerfully beneficial.
I've never heard anybody say to me, methamphetamine improved my life. I'm a better person for having used methamphetamine. Same thing with cocaine. I know people who like to use cocaine. Never heard anybody try to claim cocaine is good for me. MDMA, lots of people think that the drug improved their life and continue to think that after they've stopped using it. That's what's astonishing.
And uncertain science about brain damage promoted by the government simply cannot compete. But there is still one stark reality at the heart of the ecstasy story.
Basically, people using ecstasy now and in the past decade are acting as guinea pigs. Nobody knows exactly what the long-term effects on the brain of using this drug for a prolonged period of time regularly are yet. And the effects, quite frankly, might be devastating.
Recent studies may be reassuring to users, but no one can rule out the possibility that the government will one day discover that MDMA, ecstasy, does in fact cause long-term brain damage. The question then, will anyone believe them?
Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.